What meteorologists discovered inside this rusted time capsule from the Dust Bowl era has left modern climate research institutes racing to understand its implications. Hidden within its century-old contents lies evidence of weather prediction, methods so advanced they could revolutionize how we forecast climate patterns for decades to come. Before we reveal the forgotten technology found within this farmer's mysterious legacy, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we're sharing another incredible historical discovery that will leave you speechless. The Crawford Farm stood as a testament to perseverance amid the changing landscape of northwestern Oklahoma. While neighboring properties had long since been absorbed by corporate agricultural conglomerates with their weather monitoring stations and satellite-guided equipment, the 280-acre homestead remained stubbornly independent. At its center sat a weathered farmhouse built in 1918, its wraparound porch and faded clapboard walls bearing silent witness to 4 generations who'd endured drought, tornadoes, and the relentless transformation of American farming. The farm's original barn still housed equipment that would have been familiar to Emma Crawford's great-grandfather, restored vintage tractors that worked alongside modern machinery, and handcrafted tools that had been lovingly maintained through decades of use. Unlike the sterile, technology-dependent operations surrounding them, the Crawford property maintained an approach to farming that respected traditional methods while carefully adapting to changing times. Each piece of equipment told a story, from the carefully preserved 1930s Farmall tractor to the modern combine harvester that Emma's father had modified to work with their unique approach to weather-aware farming. Emma Crawford hadn't expected to become the guardian of her family's legacy. At 48, the former atmospheric science teacher had spent 15 years in the National Weather Service before returning to help her aging father manage the farm after her mother's passing 5 years ago. Her expertise had often seemed at odds with her father's traditional methods, but she couldn't deny their effectiveness. Now, her father's stroke 3 months earlier had thrust her into a position she never wanted, sole owner of a family farm struggling to remain viable in an era of precision agriculture and corporate farming. The Crawford property's traditional methods had made it both a curiosity and an anomaly among local agricultural experts. While surrounding farms relied heavily on advanced forecasting technology and chemical interventions, the Crawford land maintained surprisingly consistent harvests. Even during unpredictable weather events, their wheat fields had survived the devastating drought of 2023 that had wiped out crops across 3 states. Their corn had stood strong through tornadic storms that flattened neighboring fields. Regional meteorologists had often questioned Emma's father about their unusual success during extreme conditions, but he'd always just smiled and mentioned old family weather wisdom. That wisdom seemed embedded in every aspect of the farm's operation. The placement of windbreaks and shelter belts, the timing of planting and harvest, even the subtle variations in crop rotation, all seemed to anticipate weather patterns in ways that modern forecasting sometimes missed. Emma had noticed it during her years with the Weather Service. While satellite data and computer models struggled to predict the increasingly erratic weather patterns of climate change, her father's methods consistently proved reliable. The latest bank statement sat unopened on her kitchen table, its presence a constant reminder of the mounting pressures. 2 different agribusiness corporations had made offers in the past month alone, each one emphasizing the property's value for installing next-generation climate monitoring equipment. Mid-American Agricultural Systems' recent proposal of $8 million would have solved all her financial worries. But something about her great-grandfather's old study, filled with weather journals dating back to the 1920s, kept her from signing away her family's heritage. The study itself seemed frozen in time, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes documenting weather patterns, crop yields, and atmospheric observations spanning nearly a century. Her great-grandfather, Thomas Crawford, had started the records during the Dust Bowl years, developing methods that had helped their farm survive while others were abandoned to the relentless storms of dirt and wind. Those methods, passed down through generations, had continued to protect their land through decades of climatic challenges. Local farming folklore had always hinted at the Crawford family's uncanny ability to predict weather patterns. Their crop selections often anticipated droughts or excessive rainfall months before official forecasts caught up. Their harvest timing regularly avoided severe storms that caught other farms off guard. These anomalies had puzzled meteorologists and agricultural scientists for years, but Emma's father had always deflected detailed questions about their methods. The spring of 2025 had brought record-breaking weather extremes to Oklahoma's farmland, and with them came mounting pressure to modernize or sell. Emma's atmospheric science background told her that traditional farming methods shouldn't be able to cope with such unprecedented climate variations. Yet the Crawford Farm continued to thrive, its success defying both conventional wisdom and modern meteorological understanding. The discovery that would change everything came during the spring planting of 2025. Emma had been using her great-grandfather's restored 1936 John Deere tractor, a beloved piece of equipment that her father insisted worked better than modern machinery for certain tasks. The antique tractor's steel wheels and lower ground pressure had always seemed gentler on their soil, especially in the western field where the land sloped subtly toward an old creek bed. The morning had started like any other, with Emma checking the sky for signs her father had taught her to recognize, the particular way cirrus clouds stretched across the dawn horizon, the specific shade of purple that tinged the eastern clouds. These observations, once dismissed by her scientific training, had proven remarkably reliable over the past 5 years. Today they suggested perfect planting conditions, despite the official forecast calling for severe storms. As she guided the vintage tractor along the field's western edge, something unusual caught her attention. The winter's extreme temperature fluctuations had caused unprecedented soil heaving in parts of Oklahoma, and here the ground had shifted to reveal what looked like metallic glint beneath the surface. Emma might have missed it entirely if the early morning sun hadn't struck it at just the right angle. Killing the tractor's engine, she climbed down to investigate. The object was partially exposed now, its surface bearing the distinctive patina of aged metal that had spent decades underground. Using techniques learned from her father, Emma carefully cleared the surrounding soil, revealing what appeared to be a deliberately buried container. The metal box was roughly the size of a large suitcase, its construction solid despite years of burial. What caught her attention immediately was the unusual design. This wasn't some random piece of farm equipment or forgotten storage container. The box had been carefully sealed with what looked like brass fittings, and its surface bore strange markings that reminded her of meteorological symbols she'd studied during her years with the National Weather Service. But these were different, somehow more complex, incorporating elements she'd never seen before. The most striking feature was a series of dials and what appeared to be measuring devices built into the container's lid. Though clearly aged, they showed remarkable craftsmanship, their design suggesting purpose rather than decoration. One dial in particular caught her eye, its face marked with concentric circles and arrows that seemed to indicate wind patterns, but in a way that differed from any weather instrument she'd ever encountered. Emma's scientific training warred with her growing excitement. The container's location couldn't be random. It sat almost exactly at the spot where her great-grandfather's weather journals often noted unusual atmospheric readings. For years, she'd assumed those readings were simple observational errors, the kind common to early meteorological records. Now she wondered if there might be more to the story. Using her phone, she carefully documented the discovery's location and took detailed photographs of the container's position and the surrounding soil layers. Her years of scientific work had taught her the importance of proper documentation, even though every instinct urged her to open the box immediately. The soil strata around the container told their own story. This had been buried during the height of the Dust Bowl, sometime in the early 1930s. The markings on the box's surface became clearer as she cleaned away decades of accumulated soil. What she had initially taken for random scratches revealed themselves as precise engravings. Numbers and symbols formed patterns that suggested some kind of mathematical sequence, though their meaning remained elusive. Along one edge, barely visible, she made out what appeared to be a date, May 12, 1932. With trembling hands, Emma tried to lift the container. It was surprisingly heavy, suggesting contents of significant weight despite its relatively modest size. The brass fittings, though tarnished, showed remarkable preservation, as if they'd been specially treated to withstand long-term burial. This hadn't been some desperate farmer's attempt to hide valuables during the Depression. This was something else entirely, something that had been meant to be found. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted her examination. Through the morning haze, she recognized the distinctive outline of Dan Mitchell's pickup truck. The local meteorologist had been a friend of her father's and had always shown unusual interest in the Crawford Farm's weather predictions. His arrival now, just as she'd made this discovery, seemed more than coincidental. As Dan's truck pulled up to the field's edge, Emma noticed he wasn't alone. In the passenger seat sat Dr. Sarah Thompson, a climate scientist from the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman. Emma had worked with her during her weather service days, and her presence here now sent a clear message. Someone had been watching the Crawford Farm, waiting for something exactly like this. The container suddenly felt heavier in her hands, its mysteries now laden with new significance. Whatever her great-grandfather had buried here during the worst environmental disaster in American history had attracted attention far beyond their small farming community. As Dan and Dr. Thompson approached, their expressions a mix of excitement and concern, Emma realized that her family's weather wisdom might be more than just agricultural folklore. The morning sun caught the container's brass fittings, sending reflections dancing across the freshly turned soil. In the distance, clouds were building despite the clear dawn, their formations exactly matching the patterns predicted in her great-grandfather's journal entry for this date. The timing wasn't coincidental. Nothing about this discovery was. The real question was, who else knew about what lay buried beneath the Crawford Farm, and what did they expect to find inside? Dan Mitchell was the first to break the tense silence as they gathered around the mysterious container in Emma's father's study. "I've been waiting 30 years to see this," he said, his weathered hands hovering over the brass fittings. The morning light filtering through the study's eastern window caught the strange symbols etched into the metal surface, casting shadows that seemed to dance across her great-grandfather's old desk. Dr. Sarah Thompson had already set up sophisticated monitoring equipment around the room. "The electromagnetic readings are unlike anything we've ever recorded," she reported, adjusting what looked like a modified Geiger counter. "Whatever's inside is still active after all these years." Her instruments emitted a steady series of pulses that seemed to match the rhythm of the strange dials on the container's surface. Emma watched as Dan carefully examined the container's unusual markings. "Your father wasn't just being modest when he talked about old family weather wisdom," he explained, tracing one of the complex symbols. "These patterns, they're early weather prediction matrices, but they're decades ahead of their time. Some of these calculations weren't supposedly developed until the 1970s. The study itself seemed to hold its breath as they worked. Decades of weather journals lined the walls, their pages filled with observations that had helped the Crawford Farm survive while others failed. Emma had always assumed her great-grandfather's success during the Dust Bowl was just a combination of luck and careful farming. Now she wasn't so sure. "Look at this," Dr. Thompson said, pointing to a series of concentric circles engraved around the container's central dial. These aren't just wind pattern indicators. They're showing atmospheric pressure systems across multiple layers of the troposphere. In 1932, meteorologists weren't supposed to have this level of understanding about upper atmospheric conditions. Dan's expression grew more serious as he compared the container's markings to entries in Thomas Crawford's earliest weather journal. "Your great-grandfather wasn't working alone," he revealed, showing Emma a page dated May 12, 1932. There were others. A network of farmers and amateur meteorologists who discovered something during the Dust Bowl, something that changed their understanding of weather patterns completely. The journal entry described a meeting of what Thomas had called the Weather Watch, a group of farmers and scientists who had gathered secretly during the height of the environmental disaster. They had discovered patterns in the dust storms that defied conventional meteorological understanding, patterns that suggested the possibility of long-term weather prediction far beyond anything officially possible at the time. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the container's main latch. The brass fitting was warm to the touch, despite the cool morning air. "Wait," Dr. Thompson cautioned, checking her instruments one last time. "The energy readings are stabilizing. Whatever's inside, it's responding to our presence." The room fell silent, except for the steady pulse of Thompson's equipment. Emma thought about her father, now recovering in the rehabilitation center, and how he'd always insisted on maintaining the old weather observation routines. He knew about this, she realized aloud. He was protecting it, waiting for the right time. With careful precision, Emma released the first latch. The mechanism moved smoothly, as if it had been maintained despite its decades underground. Inside, they found layers of protection, oiled canvas, sealed glass containers, and at the center, something that made Dr. Thompson's instrument spike dramatically. "It's some kind of weather prediction device," Dan breathed, helping Emma lift out what looked like a complex mechanical calculator. "But the engineering, this is far beyond anything that should have existed in the 1930s. The device was a beautiful fusion of brass, copper, and what appeared to be quartz crystals, its surface covered in intricate mathematical formulas and atmospheric symbols. These calculations," Dr. Thompson said, examining the device's engravings, "they're describing weather patterns we're only now beginning to understand with modern supercomputers. Look at these equations for atmospheric energy transfer. They're accounting for variables we didn't even know existed until recently." The device wasn't alone in the container. Carefully preserved notebooks detailed the principles behind its operation, their pages filled with handwritten observations and complex mathematical formulas. The notes weren't just in Thomas Crawford's hand. There were entries from other members of the Weather Watch, each contributing their own observations and refinements to their shared discovery. "They found something during the Dust Bowl," Dan explained, his voice filled with wonder. "When the storms were at their worst, this network of observers noticed patterns that shouldn't have been possible to detect. But instead of just documenting them, they built this device to prove their theories were correct." Emma found a letter tucked between the pages of one notebook, dated just days before the container was buried. "The methods must be protected," her great-grandfather had written. "What we've discovered here goes beyond conventional meteorology. If the implications were understood too soon..." The rest of the sentence had faded with time, but his signature remained clear at the bottom. Dr. Thomson's instruments continued their steady pulsing as they examined more of the container's contents. The device seemed to be responding to current atmospheric conditions, its dials moving slightly as pressure systems shifted overhead. It's not just a historical artifact, she realized. It's still functioning, still measuring patterns we barely understand even with modern technology. The mathematical formulas detailed in the notebooks showed an understanding of atmospheric physics that shouldn't have been possible in the 1930s. The Weather Watch had somehow discovered principles that modern meteorology was only now beginning to grasp. Their observations during the Dust Bowl had led them to insights about long-term weather patterns that were decades ahead of their time. "Your great-grandfather and the others," Dan said, studying the device's intricate mechanisms. "They didn't just build this to predict weather. They created it to understand something fundamental about atmospheric patterns, something that could change how we view climate systems entirely." His fingers traced the careful engravings that spiraled around the device's central chamber. As morning turned to afternoon, the implications of their discovery began to sink in. This wasn't just a curious historical artifact or an advanced weather prediction tool. The Weather Watch had discovered something during America's worst environmental disaster that could revolutionize our understanding of climate patterns and long-term weather prediction. Emma found herself drawn to the device's central display, where brass needles moved with subtle precision across mapped coordinates. The patterns it showed matched exactly with the unusual weather conditions her father had always seemed to anticipate. "All those years," she said softly, "he was using their methods, keeping them alive until this could be found again." But as they continued to examine the container's contents, new questions emerged. Why had the Weather Watch chosen to bury their discovery rather than share it? What had they seen in the Dust Bowl's devastating storms that had led them to create such an advanced device? And perhaps most importantly, who else knew about its existence, and what would they do now that it had been found? The afternoon brought unexpected visitors to the Crawford Farm, as Emma, Dan, and Dr. Thompson continued their examination of the mysterious device. The distinct sound of helicopter rotors cut through the Oklahoma air. Through the study's window, they watched as 3 black SUVs and a helicopter bearing the logo of Global Weather Systems, Inc. approached the property. "They're here already," Dan muttered, his face darkening. Someone must have been monitoring the electromagnetic signatures. Dr. Thompson's instruments had begun registering increasingly strong pulses from the device, their rhythm somehow matching the patterns of cloud formation visible through the window. Emma quickly gathered her great-grandfather's journals, focusing on the most recent entries her father had made. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a note dated just 3 months ago before her father's stroke. He knew they were coming. "When the time comes, trust only those who understand the patterns without trying to control them." The device on the desk had begun responding more actively to their presence, its brass needles moving with increasing precision across mapped coordinates. The mathematical formulas etched into its surface seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, revealing additional layers of complexity they hadn't noticed before. Dr. Thompson's monitoring equipment was recording unprecedented readings. "Your father wasn't just preserving old weather wisdom," Dan explained urgently, helping Emma secure the most crucial documents. "He was protecting something the Weather Watch discovered during the Dust Bowl, something that could change our whole understanding of climate patterns." But they buried it because they realized it wasn't just about predicting weather. Through the window, they watched as a man in an expensive suit emerged from the lead SUV. Emma recognized him immediately. Richard Maxwell, CEO of Global Weather Systems, the world's largest private weather forecasting corporation. His company had been trying to buy out family farms across Oklahoma, installing next-generation weather monitoring equipment that supposedly could predict patterns months in advance. The Weather Watch found something during those dust storms, Dr. Thompson said, her scientific composure slipping as she checked her instruments. These readings suggest they didn't just create a prediction device, they discovered a way to understand weather patterns that went beyond mere forecasting. The implications for climate science, for atmospheric physics. Her voice trailed off. As heavy footsteps echoed through the old farmhouse, the device's needles had aligned into a pattern that exactly matched the cloud formations now gathering above the farm. Formations that defied all conventional meteorological models. The brass fittings gleamed with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with distant thunder. Ms. Crawford, Maxwell's voice carried from the front porch. We're here about some unusual atmospheric readings we've detected from your property. We have a very generous offer we'd like to discuss. The words were polite, but the tone carried an unmistakable edge of urgency and command. Emma's mind raced as she recalled her father's teachings. All those years of watching the sky, of learning to read patterns that modern meteorology said couldn't exist. The Weather Watch hadn't just been a group of farmers trying to survive the Dust Bowl. They'd been guardians of knowledge that might have been too powerful to release. Dr. Thompson's instruments suddenly registered a massive spike in electromagnetic activity. The device's central chamber had begun to rotate on its own, its carved equations aligning with what appeared to be a natural resonance in the atmosphere above. Outside, the gathering clouds had taken on an unusual formation, spinning in a pattern that exactly matched the device's movements. They don't just want to study it, Dan warned, his voice low and urgent. Global Weather Systems has been searching for something like this for years. Their latest project isn't about predicting weather, it's about controlling it. But the Weather Watch discovered that trying to control these patterns could be catastrophic. Emma found another note in her father's recent journal entries. The patterns must remain in balance. What we learned in the Dust Bowl wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding our place in nature's greater cycles. The device shows the way, but trying to force the patterns could bring destruction worse than any storm. The helicopter's downdraft rattled the study's windows as it circled the property. More vehicles were arriving, some bearing official government markings. The device's activity had intensified, its measurements now showing atmospheric conditions that shouldn't have been possible according to conventional meteorology. Your great-grandfather and the others, Dr. Thompson explained, studying the devices. Readings with growing amazement. They didn't bury this to hide it. They buried it to protect it, until humanity was ready to understand its true implications. These patterns, they're not just about weather. They're showing connections between atmospheric systems that modern science is only beginning to comprehend. Maxwell's voice came again, closer now. Ms. Crawford, our instruments indicate you've discovered something quite extraordinary. We're prepared to offer you $50 million for the property and all its contents. No questions asked. The sound of footsteps on the porch stairs emphasized the urgency of their situation. The device's needles had aligned into a configuration that sent Dr. Thompson's instruments into overdrive. The mathematical formulas carved into its surface seemed to predict not just weather patterns, but entire climate cycles. The Weather Watch had discovered something during America's worst environmental disaster that went beyond mere meteorology. They'd found a way to understand the fundamental rhythms of Earth's atmosphere. But as government vehicles continued to arrive and global weather systems helicopter circled overhead, Emma faced a crucial decision. The device's power had been hidden for nearly a century, protected by generations of her family. Now, as modern forces converged on the Crawford Farm, she had to decide, what would she do with the weather-predicting legacy her ancestors had buried in the Oklahoma soil? The moment Richard Maxwell stepped into the study, the device's readings changed dramatically. Its brass needles swung wildly before settling into a pattern that Emma recognized from her great-grandfather's journals, a warning configuration that had appeared only once before, during the worst dust storm of 1935. Remarkable, Maxwell breathed, his expensive suit out of place among the weathered furniture and old journals. After all these years, the Crawford Farm finally reveals its secrets. Behind him, two men in dark suits carried what looked like advanced scanning equipment, their devices beeping in response to the electromagnetic emissions from the Weather Watch's creation. Dr. Thompson positioned herself between Maxwell and her, monitoring equipment, her scientific calm masking obvious concern. "The energy readings are becoming unstable," she reported, watching as her instruments registered increasingly erratic patterns. "Something about their scanning equipment is interfering with the device's natural rhythms." Through the study's windows, Emma could see more global weather systems personnel setting up a perimeter around the farm. The helicopter continued to circle, now trailing what appeared to be atmospheric monitoring equipment. The afternoon sky had taken on an ominous cast, with cloud formations that defied all conventional meteorological understanding. "Let's dispense with the pretense," Maxwell said, straightening his tie. "We've been tracking weather anomalies from this property for decades. Your family's supposed traditional farming methods have produced results that our best computer models can't explain. Now we know why." His eyes fixed on the device with an intensity that made Emma instinctively step closer to it. Dan Mitchell moved to stand beside Emma, his weathered farmer's hands clenched in barely controlled anger. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he warned. "The Weather Watch didn't just create a prediction tool. They discovered something fundamental about Earth's atmospheric patterns, something that was never meant to be controlled." Maxwell's laugh held no humor. "Control is exactly what we're after, Mr. Mitchell. Global Weather Systems hasn't spent billions on research just to better predict the weather. We're going to master it." He gestured to his technical team. "Their scanning equipment confirms what we've suspected. This device doesn't just forecast weather patterns, it reveals the underlying mathematical principles that govern them." The room's tension was interrupted by a sudden spike in Dr. Thompson's readings. The device had begun to resonate with a frequency that made the old desk vibrate. Outside, the strange cloud formations had started rotating in perfect synchronization with the device's moving parts. "Your great-grandfather and the other members of the Weather Watch," Maxwell continued, "they stumbled onto something extraordinary during the Dust Bowl. While trying to survive America's worst environmental disaster, they discovered principles of atmospheric physics that modern science is only now beginning to understand." Emma found herself reaching for her father's most recent journal, its pages filled with warnings about this exact moment. "They didn't just stumble onto it," she corrected, her voice firm. "They learned something from those dust storms, something that taught them why trying to control weather patterns would be catastrophic." The device's central chamber had begun rotating faster, its carved equations glowing with what appeared to be an inner light. Dr. Thompson's instruments were recording unprecedented levels of electromagnetic activity. "These readings," she announced, her scientific detachment slipping, "they're showing atmospheric resonance patterns that shouldn't be possible." "Exactly what we've been looking for," Maxwell smiled, reaching for the device. "With this technology, global weather systems can do more than predict weather patterns. We can influence them, guide them, eventually control them completely. Imagine the possibilities and the profits." The moment Maxwell's hand touched the device, everything changed. The brass needles aligned into a configuration that Emma recognized from her great-grandfather's most urgent warnings. The mathematical Formulas etched into the surface began to pulse with energy that made the scanning equipment spark and smoke. "You're fools," Dan shouted over the rising whine of electromagnetic energy. The Weather Watch didn't bury this device to hide it from the world. They buried it to protect the world from people like you. These patterns weren't meant to be controlled. They're meant to be understood and respected. Through the windows, they could see the sky transforming. The cloud formations had taken on a structure that mimicked the device's mathematical equations exactly. Global Weather Systems helicopter was struggling against atmospheric conditions that defied their instruments' capacity to measure. "Your great-grandfather's final journal entry," Dr. Thompson said urgently, showing Emma a page that had fallen open. "Look at what he wrote. The patterns reveal the truth. Weather isn't a force to be controlled, but a dance to be understood. Those who try to lead the dance will bring destruction beyond imagination." The device's energy emissions had reached critical levels. Maxwell's scanning equipment was failing, its readings overwhelmed by forces it wasn't designed to measure. Above the farm, the impossible cloud formations had begun generating weather patterns that shouldn't have existed according to any known meteorological model. Emma understood now why her family had protected this legacy for so long. The Weather Watch hadn't just created a sophisticated prediction device. They'd discovered something far more profound during those terrible Dust Bowl years, an understanding of weather patterns that revealed both the power and the folly of trying to control nature's fundamental forces. The device's reaction to Maxwell's touch triggered a cascade of events that no one could have predicted. The brass and copper mechanisms began rotating independently, their movements creating harmonic frequencies that made Dr. Thompson's monitoring equipment spark and short-circuit. The mathematical formulas etched into the surface were now glowing, with an intensity that illuminated the entire study. "Get back!" Dan shouted, pulling Emma away from the desk as arcs of electromagnetic energy began dancing between the device's components. The quartz crystals embedded in its structure had started to resonate at frequencies that made the windows vibrate. Outside, the impossible cloud formations had begun generating weather patterns that defied all conventional meteorological understanding. Maxwell's team of technicians scrambled to adjust their scanning equipment, but their modern instruments were useless against forces they weren't designed to measure. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," Maxwell insisted, his corporate composure cracking as the device's power continued to build. "With this technology, we could control weather patterns across entire continents." But Emma had found something in her great-grandfather's final journal entries, a warning written in shaking hand just days before the device was buried. "The patterns aren't meant to be controlled," she read aloud over the rising electromagnetic whine. "They're part of a greater system, a dance of atmospheric forces that humanity must learn to understand, not dominate. Try to control them, and the consequences will be beyond imagination." Dr. Thompson's remaining functional instruments were recording unprecedented readings. "These energy signatures," she called out, studying the data scrolling across her screen. "They're not just affecting local weather patterns. The device is somehow connecting with atmospheric systems across the entire region. It's like it's accessing some kind of natural resonance network that exists in the atmosphere itself." Through the windows, they watched as the sky transformed. The cloud formations had taken on structures that perfectly matched the mathematical equations carved into the device's surface. Global Weather Systems helicopter was forced to land as atmospheric conditions became too unstable for flight. The corporation's ground teams were retreating to their vehicles as wind patterns began to swirl in impossible configurations around the farm. "Your great-grandfather and the Weather Watch," Dan explained urgently. "They discovered this during the worst of the Dust Bowl, When the storms were destroying everything, they found patterns, mathematical harmonies in the atmosphere that revealed a deeper truth about Earth's weather systems. But they also learned why those patterns should never be manipulated. The device's central chamber had begun projecting what looked like atmospheric data onto the study's walls, three-dimensional representations of weather patterns that modern meteorology hadn't even discovered yet. The mathematical formulas were showing relationships between atmospheric systems that went far beyond current scientific understanding. "Look at these equations," Dr. Thompson breathed, her scientific skepticism overwhelmed by what she was seeing. "They're not just describing weather patterns. They're showing how different layers of the atmosphere interact, how energy flows between systems, how patterns build and dissolve naturally. This is decades ahead of our current models." Maxwell's face had gone pale as he watched the projections. His dreams of controlling weather patterns were being replaced by the reality of what the Weather Watch had actually discovered. "This isn't possible," he muttered, backing away from the device. "Our most advanced supercomputers can't model atmospheric interactions with this level of complexity." Emma found herself understanding patterns that had previously seemed like random notations in the old journals. The device wasn't just showing weather data, it was revealing the fundamental mathematics of atmospheric harmony. Each formula, each spinning component demonstrated part of a vast interconnected system that humans could learn to predict but should never try to control. The Weather Watch didn't bury this to keep it secret, she realized aloud. They buried it to protect it until humanity was ready to understand its true purpose. It's not a weapon or a tool for control, it's a key to understanding our place within Earth's natural systems. The electromagnetic energy had reached levels that made Maxwell's scanning equipment explode in showers of sparks. His technical team fled the study as the device's revelations continued to build. Above the farm, the cloud formations had begun moving in patterns that demonstrated the very principles the Weather Watch had discovered, natural rhythms that showed both the power and the limitations of human intervention in atmospheric systems. "Your father knew this day would come," Dan told Emma as they watched the corporate team's retreat. "He knew someone would eventually detect the device's energy signature, would try to use it for their own purposes. That's why he made sure you understood. The old ways, the patterns in the sky. He was preparing you to protect not just the device, but the wisdom behind it." Dr. Thompson's final functioning instrument was recording something extraordinary. "The device isn't creating these weather patterns," she announced, studying the readings. "It's revealing patterns that were always there, mathematical harmonies. In the atmosphere that we've been too blind to see, the Weather Watch found a way to detect and understand these natural rhythms during the Dust Bowl. The projections had filled the study with a dance of atmospheric data, showing weather patterns from the local to the global scale. Each movement, each shifting formula demonstrated the interconnected nature of Earth's climate systems. The device wasn't a tool for controlling weather. It was a testament to the complexity and beauty of natural atmospheric harmony. As the energy emissions began to stabilize, Emma understood the true legacy her family had protected for generations. The Weather Watch hadn't just created an advanced prediction device. They discovered a way to understand weather patterns that could transform humanity's relationship with Earth's atmosphere, not through control, but through harmony and respect. In the hours following the device's dramatic demonstration, the Crawford Farm became the center of unprecedented scientific attention. As Global Weather Systems' corporate team retreated in disarray, a new group of visitors arrived, leading atmospheric scientists, meteorologists, and climate researchers from major universities and research institutions across the country. The story of what the Weather Watch had discovered during the Dust Bowl could no longer be contained. The electromagnetic signatures are still active, Dr. Thompson reported, setting up new monitoring equipment in the study. The device had settled into a steady rhythm, its brass components rotating gently as it continued to map atmospheric patterns across multiple scales. The mathematical formulas etched into its surface still glowed faintly, revealing layers of complexity that modern science was only beginning to comprehend. Dan Mitchell had begun coordinating with other meteorologists to track the device's influence on regional weather patterns. "Look at these satellite images," he said, showing Emma data streaming in from weather stations across the Midwest. "The harmonics we're seeing, they're not just local. The device is revealing patterns that connect atmospheric systems across the entire continent." Through the study's windows, they could see teams of researchers documenting everything about the Crawford property. The exact position where the device had been buried, the orientation of the farm's buildings, even the placement of ancient windbreaks. All of it seemed to follow mathematical principles that the Weather Watch had discovered during America's worst environmental disaster. "Your great-grandfather and the others," Dr. Thompson explained, comparing modern climate models with the device's projections, "they didn't just stumble onto advanced weather prediction methods. They discovered fundamental laws of atmospheric behavior that our best supercomputers are only now beginning to calculate. But they also understood why this knowledge had to be protected." Emma found herself drawn to her father's most recent journal entries, seeing them with new understanding. His meticulous weather observations, the careful maintenance of traditional farming practices, it had all been part of preserving the Weather Watch's legacy. He wasn't just keeping old traditions alive, she realized. He was maintaining a living library of atmospheric wisdom. The afternoon brought the arrival of Dr. James Chen, director of the National Climate Research Center. His team had detected the device's energy signatures from their monitoring stations and had been tracking unusual atmospheric patterns around the Crawford Farm for years. "What your family has preserved here," he told Emma, examining the device. "With obvious wonder, it could transform our entire approach to climate science." The device's projections had begun showing larger patterns, cycles of atmospheric behavior that spanned decades. Each mathematical formula, each spinning component, demonstrated principles that went far beyond simple weather prediction. The Weather Watch hadn't just created a forecasting tool. They'd discovered a way to understand the fundamental rhythms of Earth's atmosphere. "These equations," Dr. Chen breathed, studying the patterns with growing excitement. "They're showing relationships between atmospheric systems that we've only theorized about. The way energy flows between different layers of the atmosphere, how patterns build and dissipate naturally. It's all here, documented decades before we had the technology to detect it." News of the discovery had begun spreading through scientific circles. Universities were already requesting access to study the device and the Weather Watch's documentation. But Emma remembered her great-grandfather's warnings about the responsibility that came with this knowledge. The device wasn't just a scientific instrument, it was a key to understanding humanity's place within Earth's natural systems. "The Weather Watch knew this would happen," Dan explained, showing Emma more entries from the old journals. "They knew that eventually technology would advance enough to detect what they'd discovered. That's why they built so many safeguards into the device, why they coded their knowledge in ways that could only be understood by those who respected the patterns rather than trying to control them." Dr. Thompson's team had begun documenting the device's influence on local weather patterns. The unusual cloud formations had stabilized into configurations that demonstrated the very principles the Weather Watch had discovered. Natural, atmospheric harmonies that showed both the power and the limitations of human intervention in weather systems. "Your father prepared you for this," Dan reminded Emma as they watched the researchers work. "All those years of teaching you to read the sky, to understand the old ways, he was making sure you'd be ready when the device's time came." The Weather Watch's legacy isn't just about predicting weather. It's about understanding our relationship with Earth's atmosphere. The device's revelations had begun influencing weather forecasting methods across the region. Meteorologists reported increased accuracy in their predictions when they incorporated the mathematical principles it demonstrated. But more importantly, they were beginning to understand the wisdom behind the Weather Watch's decision to bury their discovery. "They saw something during the Dust Bowl," Dr. Chen explained, comparing historical records with the device's data. "When the storms were at their worst, when the sky itself seemed to have turned against humanity, they discovered patterns that revealed a deeper truth. Weather isn't a force to be controlled. It's a complex dance of natural systems that we must learn to understand and respect." As evening approached, Emma stood in her great-grandfather's study, watching the device continue its gentle rotation. The mathematical formulas it revealed weren't just scientific principles. They were a bridge between human understanding and natural wisdom, preserved through generations until humanity was ready to comprehend their true significance. 1 week after the device's activation, the Crawford Farm had transformed into an international research center. Scientists from leading meteorological institutions around the world had gathered to study what the Weather Watch had discovered during the Dust Bowl. The implications of their findings were beginning to reshape humanity's understanding of atmospheric science. "We're detecting similar harmonic patterns at weather stations across the globe," Dr. Chen announced during a morning briefing. His team had been coordinating with meteorological centers worldwide, tracking how the mathematical principles revealed by the device corresponded with global weather systems. "It's as if the atmosphere has always been speaking this language. We just didn't know how to listen." Emma spent hours in her great-grandfather's study, working with Dr. Thompson to decode more of the Weather Watch's documentation. The device continued its steady operation, projecting atmospheric data that grew more comprehensive with each passing day. "Look at these entries," Dr. Thompson said, examining a journal from 1934. They weren't just recording weather patterns. They were mapping the mathematical architecture of Earth's atmosphere. The morning's satellite data had revealed something extraordinary. Weather stations from Beijing to Buenos Aires were reporting atmospheric harmonics that perfectly matched the device's predictions. The patterns the Weather Watch had discovered during America's worst environmental disaster weren't just regional phenomena. They were fundamental principles of global atmospheric behavior. "Your great-grandfather and the others," Dan explained, showing Emma newly discovered correspondence between Weather Watch members. They realized during the Dust Bowl that weather systems were interconnected in ways that went beyond anything known to science at the time. But they also understood that this knowledge could be dangerous if misused. Through the study's windows, they could see teams of researchers working with advanced monitoring equipment. The device's influence had begun affecting weather forecasting, accuracy across the continent. Meteorologists reported unprecedented success in predicting atmospheric patterns when they incorporated the mathematical harmonics it revealed. "The implications for climate science are staggering," Dr. Chen said, reviewing the latest data. "These aren't just weather prediction methods. They're showing us how Earth's atmosphere functions as a single, interconnected system, the Weather Watch discovered principles that could transform our entire approach to understanding climate change." International news organizations had begun arriving at the farm, drawn by reports of the extraordinary discovery. But Emma remembered her father's warnings about protecting the Weather Watch's legacy. This wasn't just a scientific breakthrough to be announced to the world. It was knowledge that needed to be understood and implemented with wisdom. The device isn't just showing us patterns, Dr. Thompson observed, studying its continued operation. It's demonstrating a philosophy of atmospheric science that the Weather Watch developed during the Dust Bowl. They learned that understanding weather means recognizing our place within these natural systems, not trying to dominate them. By mid-morning, researchers had discovered something unprecedented in the Weather Watch's documentation. Hidden within the mathematical formulas were predictions about atmospheric changes that wouldn't occur for decades. The device hadn't just been designed to understand current weather patterns. It had been built to help humanity prepare for future climate challenges. "They saw this coming," Dan said softly, showing Emma passages from her great-grandfather's later journals. The Weather Watch knew that eventually human activity would begin affecting global weather patterns. They preserved their discoveries not just to help us predict the weather, but to help us understand how to live in harmony with Earth's atmosphere. The device's projections had begun showing correlations between local actions and global atmospheric effects. Each mathematical formula, each spinning component demonstrated how small changes in one region could influence weather patterns across entire continents. The Weather Watch hadn't just created a prediction tool, they'd built a way to understand humanity's role in Earth's atmospheric systems. "Look at these calculations," Dr. Chen pointed out, comparing the device's data with modern climate models. They're not just showing how weather patterns move and develop, they're revealing the delicate balance that exists in Earth's atmosphere. A balance we're only now beginning to understand, we've been disrupting. As the day progressed, the implications of the Weather Watch's discovery continued to expand. Universities worldwide were reporting successful replication of the device's basic principles using modern technology. But more importantly, they were beginning to grasp the wisdom behind its design, the understanding that weather patterns weren't forces to be controlled, but natural systems to be respected and understood. "Your family protected this knowledge for generations," Dr. Thompson told Emma as they reviewed more of the documentation. "Not just the device and its mathematical principles, but the wisdom to use this understanding responsibly." The Weather Watch didn't just discover how to predict weather patterns. They found a way to help humanity remember its connection to Earth's natural systems. The afternoon brought reports of weather stations worldwide beginning to incorporate the Weather Watch's principles into their operations. The result was an immediate improvement in forecast accuracy and a deeper understanding of atmospheric behavior. But more than that, it represented a fundamental shift in how humanity approached its relationship with Earth's weather systems. 2 weeks after the device's discovery, the first practical applications of the Weather Watch's knowledge began transforming meteorological science across the globe. The Crawford Farm had become the center of an international initiative to understand and implement the atmospheric principles that had been buried in Oklahoma soil for nearly a century. Weather stations worldwide are reporting unprecedented accuracy in their forecasts, Dr. Chen announced during an emergency conference of international climate scientists. The morning's data showed how weather centers from Tokyo to London had begun incorporating the mathematical harmonics revealed by the device. But more importantly, we're beginning to understand the atmospheric patterns that the Weather Watch discovered during the Dust Bowl. Emma spent her days working with researchers to decode more of her great-grandfather's documentation. The device continued its steady operation, now synchronized with a network of modern sensors that had been installed around the farm. "These aren't just prediction methods," she explained to visiting scientists. "The Weather Watch discovered a fundamentally different way of understanding Earth's atmosphere." The first major test of their new understanding came when the device's patterns predicted an unprecedented weather system forming over the Pacific. Traditional meteorological models hadn't detected it, but the mathematical harmonics showed something. Building that matched warnings in the Weather Watch's journals. "Your great-grandfather wrote about this," Dan said, showing Emma entries from 1935. The Weather Watch didn't just learn to predict individual storms, they discovered how major weather patterns form and evolve, but they also learned why trying to prevent or control these patterns could be catastrophic. Dr. Thompson's team had been coordinating with Pacific weather stations to track the developing system. "The device isn't just forecasting the weather," she reported, studying data streams from across the ocean. "It's showing us how different atmospheric layers interact, how energy flows between systems, how patterns build and dissipate naturally. This is revolutionizing our understanding of global weather dynamics." Through the study's windows, they watched as teams of researchers worked to integrate modern technology with the Weather Watch's principles. The farm's traditional layout, which had seemed oddly irregular to modern agricultural standards, now revealed itself as a sophisticated arrangement designed to work in harmony with natural atmospheric flows. "Global weather systems has withdrawn all their legal challenges," Dr. Chen informed them, showing official documentation. "Their attempts to replicate the device's effects artificially have all failed. They're beginning to understand what the Weather Watch discovered, that weather patterns can be understood and predicted, but never controlled without consequences." The device's influence had begun affecting agricultural practices worldwide. Farmers who adopted the Weather Watch's principles reported better crop survival during extreme weather events. The mathematical harmonics weren't just predicting weather. They were showing how to work in partnership with natural atmospheric systems. "Look at these satellite images," Dan said, displaying global weather patterns. Weather stations that have implemented the device's principles are seeing weather patterns we never detected before. The atmosphere is revealing layers of complexity that modern technology missed because we weren't looking for the right things. By mid-afternoon, researchers had made another breakthrough in understanding the Weather Watch's legacy. The device wasn't just measuring current conditions, it was showing how local weather patterns connected to global atmospheric cycles. Each mathematical formula demonstrated principles that linked small-scale weather events to larger climate systems. The Weather Watch saw something during the Dust Bowl that changed their understanding completely, Dr. Thompson explained, reviewing their latest findings. When the storms were destroying everything they knew, they discovered that weather isn't just a force of nature to be fought or controlled. It's part of a vast, interconnected system that humans need to learn to work with, not against. International agricultural organizations had begun sending representatives to study the Crawford Farm's layout. The placement of windbreaks, the arrangement of fields, even the timing of traditional farming practices, all of it followed principles that the Weather Watch had discovered during America's worst environmental disaster. "Your father preserved more than just old farming methods," Dan told Emma as they watched the researchers work. "He maintained a living example of how to farm in harmony with atmospheric patterns." The Weather Watch didn't just create a prediction device, they developed a complete system for working with nature instead of trying to dominate it. The late afternoon brought reports of successful implementations from weather stations across Europe and Asia. The mathematical harmonics were proving universal. The patterns the Weather Watch had discovered during the Dust Bowl worked just as effectively in the steppes of Mongolia as they did in the plains of Oklahoma. This is why they buried the device, Emma realized, reading more of her great-grandfather's journals. They knew humanity wasn't ready for this knowledge in the 1930s. We needed to learn the hard way that trying to control weather and climate would only lead to greater problems. They preserved their discoveries until we were ready to understand the true message, that working with natural patterns is more powerful than trying to control them. The device's projections had begun showing long-term atmospheric trends that modern climate models had missed. Each mathematical sequence, each rotating component, demonstrated principles that connected daily weather patterns to larger climate cycles. The Weather Watch hadn't just created a better way to predict weather. They'd discovered how to understand Earth's atmospheric systems as a living, breathing whole. 1 month after the device's discovery, the transformation of weather science had exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. The Crawford Farm, once threatened by corporate buyouts, had become an international center for atmospheric research, its heritage now protected by a special scientific designation. The Weather Watch's legacy, preserved through generations of careful stewardship, was finally beginning to reshape humanity's relationship with Earth's atmosphere. The results from global implementation are extraordinary, Dr. Chen reported during a worldwide conference broadcast from the farm's converted barn. Behind him, screens displayed real-time data from weather stations across the planet. Weather prediction accuracy has improved by over 300% in regions using the Weather Watch's principles. But more importantly, we're beginning to understand what they truly discovered during the Dust Bowl. Emma stood in her great-grandfather's study, now a sophisticated research center where modern technology worked alongside the original device. The mathematical harmonics, it revealed, had begun influencing everything from agricultural practices to urban planning. They didn't just find a way to predict weather, she explained to visiting scientists. They discovered how to read the atmosphere's natural language. The device's impact had spread far beyond meteorology. Agricultural centers worldwide reported unprecedented success in adapting farming practices to work with weather patterns rather than fighting against them. Urban planners were redesigning cities based on the atmospheric flow principles the Weather Watch had documented. Even renewable energy projects were being modified to better align with natural atmospheric rhythms. Your great-grandfather and the others, Dan said, showing Emma newly translated portions of the Weather Watch's documentation. They saw beyond the immediate crisis of the Dust Bowl. They realized that humanity would eventually face even greater environmental challenges. This device wasn't just built to help them survive their present. It was designed to help us navigate our future. Dr. Thompson's research team had made breakthrough discoveries about the device's deeper functions. The mathematical harmonics aren't just predicting weather, she explained, reviewing the latest data. They're showing us how atmospheric patterns interact with human activity. The Weather Watch discovered principles that could help us address climate change itself. Through the study's windows, they could see teams of international researchers working with advanced monitoring equipment. The device's influence had begun affecting climate modeling worldwide. Scientists reported that when they incorporated the Weather Watch's principles into their climate predictions, they discovered natural correction patterns that offered hope for environmental restoration. Global weather systems has completely transformed their approach, Dr. Chen announced, showing official documentation. They're now leading efforts to implement the Weather Watch's principles across their network. Their CEO admitted that trying to control weather was the wrong approach. Understanding and working with natural patterns is far more powerful. The morning's satellite data revealed something extraordinary. Regions that had adopted the Weather Watch's principles were showing signs of atmospheric healing. The mathematical harmonics weren't just helping predict weather. They were showing humanity how to restore natural balance to Earth's atmospheric systems. Look at these readings, Dan said, displaying global weather maps. The patterns the device reveals, they're not just about prediction. They're showing us how the atmosphere naturally maintains equilibrium. The Weather Watch discovered principles that could help us repair the damage we've done to Earth's climate systems. By mid-afternoon, researchers had uncovered another layer of significance in the Weather Watch's legacy. The device wasn't just measuring atmospheric conditions, it was demonstrating how human activities could work in harmony with natural weather patterns. Each mathematical formula showed ways to align human development with Earth's natural rhythms. What they discovered during the Dust Bowl, Dr. Thompson explained, studying the latest data, was more than just advanced meteorology. They found evidence that the atmosphere operates as a self-regulating system. Our attempts to control weather have been disrupting natural patterns that maintain Earth's climate balance. International environmental organizations had begun implementing the Weather Watch's principles in climate restoration projects. The placement of reforestation efforts, the design of carbon capture systems, even the timing of conservation activities, all were being modified to work with the atmospheric patterns the device revealed. Your father protected this knowledge until humanity was ready, Dan told Emma as they watched teams of researchers work. He knew that what the Weather Watch discovered wasn't just about weather prediction. It was about remembering how to live in harmony with Earth's natural systems. The late afternoon brought reports of successful atmospheric restoration initiatives from around the world. The mathematical harmonics were proving to be universal guides for environmental recovery. The patterns the Weather Watch had discovered during America's worst environmental disaster were now helping address global climate challenges. This is what they were protecting, Emma realized, reading more of her great-grandfather's final journal entries. They knew that eventually humanity would reach a point where we had to choose between controlling nature and working with it. They preserved their discoveries until we were ready to make the right choice. The device's projections had begun showing long-term patterns of atmospheric recovery. Each mathematical sequence demonstrated how human activities could align with natural cycles to restore environmental balance. The Weather Watch hadn't just created a prediction tool. They discovered principles that could help humanity become stewards rather than controllers of Earth's atmosphere. 3 months after the device's discovery, Emma sat in her father's rehabilitation center, sharing the latest developments from the farm. His recovery had progressed enough that he could now understand the full impact of what his family had protected for generations. The Weather Watch's legacy had grown far beyond weather prediction, inspiring a fundamental shift in how humanity approached its relationship with Earth's natural systems. The principles are being implemented worldwide, she explained, showing him photographs of the transformed farm. The once modest homestead had become a living laboratory where scientists from across the globe came to study not just weather patterns, but the deeper wisdom the Weather Watch had preserved. But it's not just about the technology anymore. People are beginning to understand what you and great-grandfather always knew, that working with nature is more powerful than trying to control it. Back at the farm, Dr. Chen's team had made another breakthrough in understanding the device's broader implications. The mathematical harmonics don't just apply to weather, he explained during the morning briefing. They're showing us patterns that appear throughout nature, in ocean currents, in forest growth cycles, even in the way cities naturally develop. The Weather Watch discovered something fundamental about how natural systems maintain balance. The study, now a sophisticated research center, still maintained its original character. Among the advanced monitoring equipment and international research teams, Emma had preserved her great-grandfather's original furniture and journals. It's important to remember how this knowledge came to us, she told visiting scientists. The Weather Watch didn't make their discovery in a high-tech laboratory. They found it by paying attention to nature's own patterns during America's worst environmental disaster. Dr. Thompson's latest research had revealed something extraordinary about the device's influence. Communities that implement these principles aren't just getting better weather forecasts, she reported, reviewing global data. They're experiencing a kind of environmental healing. When human activities align with the natural patterns the device reveals, ecosystems begin to restore themselves. Through the windows, they could see groups of farmers touring the property, learning how to apply the Weather Watch's principles to their own land. The mathematical harmonics weren't just improving crop yields. They were showing how agriculture could work in partnership with natural systems rather than against them. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," Dan said, showing Emma newly discovered photographs of the original Weather Watch members. They didn't just preserve advanced weather prediction methods. They protected a different way of seeing our place in the natural world, one that we're finally ready to understand. The morning's satellite data had revealed patterns that extended far beyond atmospheric systems. Researchers had begun detecting similar mathematical harmonics in everything from river flow patterns to migration routes. The Weather Watch's discovery was proving to be a key to understanding how all natural systems maintain balance. Global Weather Systems has completely rebranded, Dr. Chen announced, displaying their new research initiatives. They're now the largest funder of programs teaching the Weather Watch's principles worldwide. Their CEO admitted that their previous approach to weather control was fundamentally flawed. Nature's own patterns are far more sophisticated than anything we could design. Emma spent hours in the study each day, continuing to decode more of the Weather Watch's documentation. The device's steady operation had become a symbol of the balance they had discovered. Complex mathematics working in harmony with natural rhythms. They weren't just scientists, she explained to visitors. They were pioneers who found a new way of understanding humanity's relationship with Earth's systems. The transformation hadn't been limited to weather science. Urban planners were redesigning cities to work with natural airflow patterns. Engineers were modifying renewable energy systems to align with atmospheric rhythms. Even transportation networks were being adapted to take advantage of natural energy flows, the device revealed. "Look at these patterns," Dr. Thompson said, displaying new data from across the globe. "When human activities align with the mathematical harmonics, we see immediate improvements in environmental health. It's as if the atmosphere itself is showing us how to restore natural balance." International environmental organizations had begun incorporating the Weather Watch's principles into climate restoration efforts. The mathematical harmonics weren't just predicting weather. They were providing a blueprint for how humanity could help heal damaged ecosystems. "Your father protected this knowledge until exactly the right moment," Dan told Emma as they watched another group of researchers arrive. He knew that what the Weather Watch discovered wasn't just about weather. It was about remembering our place within Earth's natural systems. The late afternoon brought reports of successful implementations from around the world. Communities that adopted the Weather Watch's principles reported not just better weather prediction, but a deeper connection to their local environment. The patterns they had discovered during the Dust Bowl were helping humanity rediscover its role as stewards rather than controllers of nature. This is what they saw during those terrible storms, Emma realized, reading one of her great-grandfather's final entries. When everything was being destroyed by dust and wind, they discovered that the only way forward was to understand and work with nature's own patterns. They preserved this knowledge not just to help us predict weather, but to help us remember This fundamental truth, the device's influence continued to spread beyond its original purpose. Each mathematical sequence it revealed showed another way that human activities could align with natural rhythms. The Weather Watch hadn't just created a sophisticated prediction tool, they'd discovered principles that could help humanity restore its broken connection with the natural world. 6 months after the device's discovery, the Crawford Farm had become more than just a research center. It was a symbol of humanity's potential to restore its relationship with nature. The small Oklahoma homestead that had once struggled to survive now hosted visitors from around the world, all coming to learn the wisdom that the Weather Watch had preserved through generations of careful stewardship. Emma's father had finally returned home, his recovery complete enough to see firsthand how his family's legacy had transformed the world. Sitting in his old study, now a sophisticated blend of historical preservation and cutting-edge research, he watched the device continue its steady operation. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," he told Emma, his voice strong despite his recent illness. "Not just of the discovery, but of how you've helped people understand what it really means." Dr. Chen's team had compiled the first comprehensive report on the global implementation of Weather Watch principles. "The results are beyond anything we could have imagined," he announced during an international conference broadcast from the farm. "Weather prediction accuracy has become nearly perfect in regions using these methods. But more importantly, we're seeing signs of natural atmospheric healing in areas where human activities have been aligned with the mathematical harmonics." The morning light filtered through the study's eastern window, catching the device's brass components as they rotated in their endless dance with atmospheric patterns. Emma had maintained her great-grandfather's original furniture arrangement, creating a space where past and future merged seamlessly. Modern researchers worked at advanced monitoring stations while sitting in chairs that had witnessed the device's burial during the Dust Bowl. "The transformation goes far beyond meteorology," Dr. Thompson explained, reviewing the latest global data. "Communities that have adopted these principles report a fundamental shift in how they relate to their environment. It's as if the Weather Watch's discovery has helped humanity remember something we had forgotten about our place in nature's patterns." Through the windows, they could see groups touring the property: scientists, farmers, urban planners, and environmental experts, all coming to learn from what the Weather Watch had preserved. The farm's layout itself had become a teaching tool, demonstrating how human activities could work in harmony with natural systems. "Your great-grandfather and the other Weather Watch members," Dan said, showing Emma newly discovered photographs from the 1930s. "They didn't just stumble onto advanced weather prediction methods during the Dust Bowl. They found evidence that humanity once understood these patterns, that we once knew how to live in balance with Earth's systems. They preserved that knowledge until we were ready to remember." The device's influence had spread far beyond its original purpose. The mathematical harmonics it revealed were being applied to everything from ecosystem restoration to sustainable urban development. Each pattern showed another way that human activities could align with nature's rhythms rather than disrupting them. "Look at these satellite images," Dr. Chen said, displaying global weather patterns. Regions that have implemented Weather Watch principles aren't just experiencing better weather prediction, they're showing signs of atmospheric restoration. It's as if the Earth's natural systems are remembering their original balance. Emma's father spent hours sharing memories of how his own father had taught him to maintain the Weather Watch's legacy. "We weren't just keeping old farming traditions alive," he explained to visiting researchers. "We were protecting knowledge that humanity would need when it finally realized that controlling nature isn't the answer. Understanding and working with it is." The afternoon brought news of another breakthrough in understanding the device's broader implications. Researchers had discovered that the mathematical harmonics appeared in everything from ocean current patterns to forest growth cycles. The Weather Watch hadn't just created a weather prediction tool. They'd found a key to understanding how all natural systems maintain balance. Global Weather Systems has officially rebranded as Earth Systems Harmony, Dr. Thompson announced, showing the new research initiatives. They're now the leading advocate for implementing Weather Watch principles worldwide. Their CEO said something remarkable, that trying to control weather was like trying to control a symphony by grabbing the conductor's baton. What we needed to learn was how to listen to the music and join in harmony. The device's steady operation had become a symbol of the balance the Weather Watch had discovered. Complex mathematics working in perfect synchronization with natural rhythms. Each rotation, each mathematical formula demonstrated another way that humanity could restore its broken connection with Earth's systems. This is what they protected, Emma realized, reading her great-grandfather's final journal entry with new understanding. When the dust storms were destroying everything they knew, they discovered that the path forward wasn't through conquering nature, but through remembering how to work with it. They preserved this knowledge not just to help us predict weather, but to help us remember our true role as part of Earth's natural patterns. As evening approached, Emma stood with her father in the study that had changed everything. The device continued its gentle rotation, its brass components catching the last rays of sunlight. Outside, the Oklahoma sky displayed weather patterns that perfectly matched the mathematical harmonics the Weather Watch had discovered nearly a century ago. The legacy isn't just in the device or the mathematics, her father said, watching researchers work with the latest atmospheric data. It's in remembering what your great-grandfather and the others learned during the Dust Bowl, that the most powerful force isn't human control over nature, but human harmony with it. The Crawford Farm would continue to stand as a testament to the Weather Watch's vision, its fields and buildings demonstrating principles that had waited generations to be rediscovered. The financial struggles that had once threatened its existence were long forgotten, replaced by a new purpose that would ensure its preservation for centuries to come. But more importantly, the Weather Watch's legacy had given humanity something it desperately needed: hope. Hope that environmental damage could be healed, that climate patterns could be restored, that humanity could learn to work in partnership with nature rather than against it. The device they had buried during America's worst environmental disaster had become a key to understanding humanity's potential for environmental harmony. As stars appeared above the transformed farm, Emma thought about all the generations of her family who had protected this knowledge, waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready to understand its true significance. The Weather Watch's discovery had finally fulfilled its purpose, not just revealing patterns in the sky, but helping humanity remember its place within the greater patterns of nature itself. 5 years after the discovery of the Weather Watch's device, Emma Crawford stood at the podium of the newly established Global Atmospheric Harmony Center, built on land adjacent to the original farm. Behind her, the historic farmhouse and barn stood preserved exactly as they had been, while around them sprawled one of the world's most advanced environmental research facilities. When my great-grandfather and the Weather Watch buried this device, during the Dust Bowl, she began her address to an international audience. They couldn't have known exactly how their discovery would transform the world, but they understood something fundamental, that the key to humanity's future lay not in controlling nature, but in learning to read and work with its patterns. The original device, still functioning perfectly, now occupied a special chamber. In the research center, its brass components continuing their endless dance with atmospheric rhythms. But its influence had spread far beyond weather prediction. The mathematical harmonics it revealed had become the foundation for a new understanding of how human civilization could work in partnership with Earth's natural systems. The latest global climate data is remarkable, Dr. Chen reported, displaying worldwide atmospheric patterns. Regions that fully implemented Weather Watch principles 5 years ago are showing unprecedented environmental recovery. The mathematics of harmony they discovered during the Dust Bowl has proven to be the key to restoring Earth's natural balance. The Crawford Farm itself had become a living classroom where visitors could see the Weather Watch's principles in action. The traditional field layouts, building placements and farming methods that had once seemed outdated now demonstrated sophisticated understanding of atmospheric flows and natural patterns. "Your father would be so proud," Dan Mitchell said, now director of the center's educational programs. Though Emma's father had passed away the previous year, his legacy lived on in every aspect of their work. He protected this knowledge until humanity was ready, just as his father and grandfather did before him. Dr. Thompson's research team had continued making discoveries about the device's broader applications. The mathematical harmonics appear everywhere in nature, she explained, showing patterns that ranged from ocean currents to forest growth cycles. The Weather Watch didn't just find a way to predict weather, they discovered fundamental principles of how natural systems maintain balance. The morning satellite imagery showed something extraordinary, the first visible signs of global atmospheric healing. Areas that had adopted Weather Watch principles exhibited improving weather patterns, reduced severe events, and the restoration of natural climate cycles that had been disrupted by human activity. "Look at these long-term trends," Dr. Chen said, displaying data collected over the past 5 years. When human activities align with the mathematical harmonics, we see immediate environmental improvements. It's as if the atmosphere itself is showing us how to heal the damage we've done. The center had become more than just a research facility. It was a symbol of hope, demonstrating that humanity could learn from its past mistakes and find a new way forward. The Weather Watch's legacy had sparked a global movement toward environmental harmony, transforming everything from agriculture to urban planning. Global weather systems transformation was just the beginning, Dr. Thompson noted, reviewing worldwide implementation data. Now, major corporations and governments worldwide are restructuring their approaches to align with these principles. They've realized that working with nature's patterns is more profitable and sustainable than trying to control them. Emma often found herself in her great-grandfather's study, maintained exactly as it had been when the device was discovered. The old journals still lined the walls, their pages containing wisdom that had waited generations to be understood. But now they were joined by new volumes, documenting how the Weather Watch's discoveries were helping humanity remember its place within Earth's natural systems. The device wasn't just a technological achievement, she explained to visiting researchers. It was a key to remembering something humanity had forgotten, that we are part of nature's patterns, not separate from them. The Weather Watch preserved this knowledge during our darkest environmental disaster, knowing we would need it to face the challenges ahead. As evening approached, Emma stood with Dan and Dr. Thompson in the original demonstration plot where the device had been unearthed. The Oklahoma sky above them displayed weather patterns that perfectly matched the mathematical harmonics discovered nearly a century ago, but now these patterns were being read and understood by people around the world. "Your great-grandfather wrote something interesting in his final journal entry," Dan said, showing Emma a newly translated passage. He said that burying the device wasn't about hiding knowledge, it was about preserving wisdom until humanity had learned enough from its mistakes to use it properly. Looking at what's happened in the past 5 years, I'd say that time has finally come. The Crawford Farm would continue to stand as a bridge between past and future, its fields and buildings demonstrating principles that had waited generations to be rediscovered. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of humanity's potential to learn from its past and create a better future. As stars appeared above the transformed landscape, Emma thought about all the generations of her family who had protected the Weather Watch's legacy. They had preserved more than just a sophisticated weather prediction device. They had protected wisdom that would help humanity remember its true role as part of Earth's natural patterns, not its master. The mathematical harmonics that had been buried in Oklahoma's soil during the Dust Bowl had finally fulfilled their purpose, showing humanity a path back to environmental harmony. And as research centers around the world continued to discover new applications of these principles, it became clear that the Weather Watch's legacy would continue transforming our relationship with nature for generations to come.